In this session, we're going to talk about the encounters that Jesus had with his neighbors, those in whose midst he grew up, those who lived around him in his boyhood home of Nazareth. Now, we've talked about the chronology of Jesus' life, what we call the harmony of the Gospels. That is, how do the Gospels fit together? You have 4 different accounts of Jesus' life and ministry. Those accounts do not record what Jesus does in the exact same sequences. So sometimes you have to combine one gospel with another to figure out what happens when. This is not necessarily an exact science. It takes some research, it takes some thinking. Scholars don't always agree as to what happened before and what happened next and what happened after. We have said that when you put the Gospel of John together with the Gospel of Matthew, we see that he's baptized in Matthew 3, he's tempted in Matthew 4, he walks back to the scene of his baptism in John 1, he walks out of John 1 with 5 disciples to Cana of Galilee to the wedding in John chapter 2. In Luke's arrangement of the material, he places a sermon in Nazareth right after the temptation of Jesus. Now, he doesn't tell us anything about the wedding. Only John tells us about the wedding. It could be that after Jesus went to the wedding at Cana, that he went home, that he went home to Nazareth. Whenever it happened, it did happen, and it's recorded in Luke chapter 4. Jesus comes home to Nazareth, and he gets the place of honor as the teacher in the synagogue. It says he came to Nazareth. This is Luke 4, verse 16. Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as was his custom, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day. We can say that Jesus always went to church. That was his custom. He goes to the place of worship on the day of worship. And he stood up to read. In those days, they stood up to read and sat down to teach. The scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it is written. This is Isaiah chapter 61. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives, recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. And the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. And he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." You know what he's saying? He's saying, I just read a document that was written 800 years ago. Do you know who the prophet was writing about 800 years ago? He was writing about me. Today, this prophecy is fulfilled in your hearing. This is an amazing, astounding claim for somebody to make in a synagogue in the first century. And you know what? When they heard that, they liked it. It says in verse 22, all spoke well of him and marveled at the gracious words that were coming from his mouth. And they said, isn't this Joseph's son? And what they mean is, hey, I know the boy's family. I know his father. He's making us famous down there in Judea. He's making a big hit. People are talking about him. They're talking about us because we're from his hometown. And you know what? I know the family. I knew him when he was a boy. I knew him when he was growing up. He's bringing attention and glory and prominence and fame to me because this is my hometown. I'm from Nazareth and he's from Nazareth. So this is a good thing. This is a positive thing. It says that they were all marveling. They were amazed at the gracious words that were coming from his mouth. Then he says, you will say to me, physician, heal yourself. We heard about what you did in Capernaum. He did mighty works in Capernaum. So you need to do it here in your hometown as well. Then he says, truly I say to you, no prophet is acceptable in his hometown. Okay, now, he enters into some dangerous territory. I'm going to go ahead and say this now. I won't wait until it happens in the text. After he says what he's about to say, they try to kill him. When you look down to verse 29, it says they rose up, they drove him out of the town, they brought him to the edge of a cliff, and they were going to throw him off the cliff. So we have to ask ourselves the question, what on earth did he do to offend them? How could 1 minute they like everything he was saying? They were wondering at his gracious words. They were proud of him. He was their hometown boy. He was bringing a good reputation to his hometown, and they really, really like that. Then he tells them something, and they try to kill him. What did he tell them? He told them what the Bible said. He told them what the Old Testament said. He told them of 2 accounts from the Old Testament, from 2 prophets in the Old Testament. They knew the stories very, very well, but they missed the point of the stories. They didn't know what the stories meant. After he told the stories in such a way that they began to suspect what the stories meant, they hated it. And they hated him. And they hated it so much that they tried to kill him. So what stories did he tell? And what did the stories mean? And why were the stories so offensive? Now, when the Pharisees say to Jesus in another place, search and you'll see that no prophets come from Galilee, that really wasn't true. Even though it wasn't called Galilee, there were 2 of the most famous prophets were from the north of Israel. And their names were Elijah and Elisha. And what Jesus is saying is, you know, you're really excited that I'm being celebrated and honored and hailed as a prophet because I'm from our neighborhood. But you know what? I'm not the first prophet from our neighborhood. I'm not the first famous prophet to come from the north of Israel. You remember Elijah came from around here. And Elisha came from around here. And we know that they are true prophets of God. They were true prophets of God. Now, what did they teach? What did these 2 prophets of God, these 2 true prophets of God, what did they do, and what can we learn from what they did? Well, we have to ask ourselves the question, what was the great problem in Elijah's generation? Because the Lord mentions Elijah first. He says, I'll tell you what, there were lots of widows in Israel in the days of Elijah when the heavens were shut up 3 years and 6 months and a great famine came over the land. Well, the great problem in Elijah's day that there was a drought. A drought means it didn't rain. Because there was a great drought, there was a great famine. It didn't rain, so they couldn't grow food. Because they couldn't grow food, people were starving to death. This was the great problem in Elijah's day. But the problem was not the weather. The problem was the ruler. The northern kingdoms of Israel had a wicked ruler named Elijah, who was married to a wicked woman named Jezebel. Jezebel was the daughter of a pagan priest, and she was the great champion of Baal worship in Israel. This offended God. The king of Israel, Ahab, married a Phoenician woman, Jezebel, who was really not much more than a witch. And because of that, God judged Israel, shut the windows of heaven, stopped the rain, everybody was starving to death. And who did they blame it on? Well, they blamed it on that Phoenician woman, that Phoenician witch, who's not even a Jew. Now, Elijah was a mighty prophet who had to go into hiding because he spoke out against Elijah's wickedness. Now, look at what Jesus says. Jesus is not introducing a new story. Jesus is not talking about something they didn't already know. But he's bringing the story up in such a way that they would see something that they hadn't seen before. By the way he asks a question about the story. You see, by the way he emphasizes a certain point of the story. And here's what he says. You know what? There were a lot of poor widows in Israel in those days. In other words, there were a lot of women who couldn't support themselves because their husband was dead and he had been the one earning money. And now they didn't have a man to take care of them, to provide for them, to earn money for them. So they're starving to death because there's a famine and because there's a drought and nobody has anything to eat. So God sends a miracle of relief. He sends a miracle of relief to one starving widow. But does he send the prophet Elijah and the miracle of relief to a Jewish widow? No, he doesn't. He sends relief to a widow of Zarephath. Where is Zarephath? Zarephath is in the region of Sidon. Sidon is in Phoenicia. That's where Jezebel came from. So, what's the problem in Israel? The problem is a Phoenician woman. Who does God show mercy to during the time of starvation? He shows mercy to a Phoenician woman. Now, do you know why Jesus is counterintuitive? Because he's like his Father. And his Father is counterintuitive. If the problem is a Phoenician widow, is a Phoenician woman, wouldn't you think that God would show mercy to a Jewish widow? He doesn't. He shows mercy to a Phoenician widow. Jezebel's family, not a Jewish family. Jesus doesn't stop there. He then goes on to talk about Elijah's assistant, Elijah's protege, the younger prophet Elisha, who takes over for Elijah. He's also from our neighborhood. He's also from the north of Israel. And at that time, Israel was being threatened on her northern flank by the military might of Syria. Syria posed a great threat to the security of Israel. And there was a great military leader in Syria whose name was Naaman. Now that's the bad news when your enemy has a great military leader. That's really bad news. But there's some good news. He's sick. And he's got a disease which will kill him. Take him out of the action. And he won't be a threat to us anymore. His name is Naaman. So, Jesus says, in the generation of Elisha, verse 27, there were a lot of lepers in Israel. In other words, there were a lot of guys on our side who had leprosy. You know, if they didn't have leprosy, maybe they could be soldiers. Maybe they could fight for us. Maybe they could be in the army. But they couldn't because they had leprosy. So, God decides to heal a leper. Which leper does he heal? Does he heal a Jewish leper who can fight in the Jewish army, who can help the side of Israel? Oh no. he sends Elisha to heal the Syrian general, to make him well, the man on the wrong side, the man on the enemy side. Now, Jesus didn't make these stories up. Jesus didn't write these stories. These stories are in the Hebrew Scriptures. They're a part of the Bible of these people who come to the synagogue to study the Bible, to find out what the Bible is saying. So Jesus tells them what the Bible is saying. Now, what did the people of Israel want Messiah to do? They wanted the Messiah to punish the Gentiles. They wanted the Messiah to throw the Gentiles out of Israel, to evict these filthy Romans with their soldiers, and to make them leave our country, leave us alone, leave us in freedom. Stop taxing us, stop ruling us, stop dominating us. Well, they're starting to really hope that maybe Jesus is the Messiah. And by the way, what about Rome? Well, you know what? It almost looked like Rome had received the millennial promises that God gave to Israel. The millennial promises to Israel were that Israel was going to dominate the world during the millennium. But you know what? It was Rome which dominated the world. It was the Roman emperor who was called the Pontifex Maximus, the highest priest. It was the one who sat on the throne of Rome who was being worshiped. The Roman emperor was called God. It wasn't the one who sat on David's throne in Jerusalem who was being worshiped. It was the Roman ruler, not the Jewish ruler. What a horrible thought that all the great things that God had promised to the Jews were being given to the Gentiles. So they're very hopeful, since Jesus is doing mighty works, that maybe he's going to do everything they hoped the Messiah would do. So he gets a chance to preach in his hometown, in the synagogue. Wow, wonder what he's going to say. Well, he just tells them two stories that are in the Bible. He says, you know, you were very excited about the fact that I'm from here and you hope I'll do something great. Well, you know, we've had other prophets that were around here. What did they do? What did they teach you? What they taught you was that God is going to show mercy to the Gentiles. That God has meant to show mercy to the Gentiles all along. This is who God is. This is what my Father is like. And you know what? I haven't come to kill the Gentiles. I haven't come to conquer the Gentiles in battle. I haven't come to drive the Gentiles out. I've come to bring the Gentiles in. I've come to bless the Gentiles. I've come to save the Gentiles. You want me to save you militarily and politically. I'm going to save the Gentiles spiritually. Once they began to understand that this is what he was saying, they tried to kill him. Very, very, very early, once his message was understood, they tried to kill him. They knew they were going to kill him. They knew he had to die. I've mentioned Timothy Keller before. He has a saying, this great preacher in Manhattan in New York City. He says that once we understand the message of Jesus, we understand that Jesus is saying, you've got a choice to make. You can do one of two things. You can crown me, or you can kill me. You can worship me as king, or you can murder me. You can turn me into a corpse. And everybody has that choice to make. Are we going to set him on the throne, or are we going to hang him on the cross? Are we going to crown him, or are we going to kill him? You know what? His neighbors made that decision. I told you earlier that Jesus speaks to thoughts. Well, I said that he spoke to thoughts when Mary said they're out of wine, John chapter 2. I also said that that's not the only time he speaks to thoughts in John chapter 2, because the first part of John chapter 2 is the story of the miracle of water to wine in the wedding feast of Cana of Galilee. The second part of John chapter 2 is the story of the cleansing of the temple. Well, after the cleansing of the temple, in John 2:18, the Jews say to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" In other words, you need to work a miracle to prove that you have the authority to do these things. Now, in response to that, Jesus says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Now, that doesn't seem to fit. That doesn't seem to be in context. In other words, his enemies say one thing, and he seems to answer a different question. Why does he seem to change the subject? He's not changing the subject. He's speaking to their thoughts. What they say with their words is, you need to show us a sign to prove that you have the right to do this. That's what they say with their mouth. What they're thinking with their thoughts is, we're going to kill you. We're going to kill you for this. You've got to die because you did this. So he speaks to their thoughts. He says, you can kill me, all right. You can destroy this body. One day I'm going to let you kill me. But you know what? In 3 days I'll be alive again. So it was his experience with the Jewish leaders who controlled the temple traffic in Jerusalem in John chapter 2. It was his experience with his simple neighbors in the synagogue in Nazareth of Galilee in Luke chapter 4. That once they understood what he'd come to do, once they understood what he'd come to say, they wanted to kill him.
TVS Seminary is a great way to invest in the kingdom of God. Please consider making a donation to support this effective educational and outreach ministry today. We exist upon your gracious giving. Please donate to support TVS Project's continuation and growth. For more information, visit tvsseminary.com.
Now, there are two great lessons here. Really, it's just one lesson. We need to understand that God is God, and we need to let God be God. Here's what that means. If Jesus disturbs our religious position, our role in the church, our job as a leader, what we think we have a right to do, we need to bow to him, and we need to take a different place. We need to take a lower place. Once Jesus came and showed that I'm going to be in control of what happens in the temple, you can't make money out of the temple from this way. You can't do these things in my Father's house. You can't make my Father's house, which was meant to be a house of prayer, a house of commercial activity, a house of merchandise. I'm going to decide. You're not going to decide. Instead of bowing down to him, they decided they were going to kill him. Now, he also has the right to decide what position our family is going to have, what position our nation is going to have. Let me tell you something as a pastor. The hardest influence to overcome with the gospel is romance. If a person thinks they're in love, and that love is not in God's will, that romance is not in God's will, they're not going to listen. They're going to worship Venus. They're going to worship Aphrodite. They're going to worship the goddess of love. They're not going to worship the God of Israel. Not unless the Holy Spirit does something very, very powerful. As a pastor, when I've had to deal with adultery among people in my church, I have never been able to slow down the adultery, much less stop it, as long as the two parties thought they were in love. They were going to worship their love, their adultery, before they worship the God of Israel. Now, a close second to romance is nationalism, the love of country. And let me tell you what I mean by nationalism. Patriotism is a beautiful thing. It's a wonderful thing. What is patriotism? Patriotism says, I love my country because it is my country. That's good. That's beautiful. There's nothing wrong with that. Nationalism says, I hate your country because it's not my country. That's terrible. That's awful. That's a sin. And it takes great Christian discipline, great godly discipline to hold patriotism in the place of patriotism and not to let patriotism metastasize like cancer and grow into the tumor of nationalism, which will kill you. But you see, these people were nationalists. And the idea that God would bless the Syrians, the idea that God would bless the Phoenicians, that offended them. All Jesus was bringing was the message that he read in the Bible, in the Old Testament. You can read all about this in 1st and 2nd Kings. But once he pointed that message out, once he made it plain to them that God wasn't only going to bless the Jews, God was also going to bless the Gentiles. The Jews were raised up by God to be a nation of priests. When God called the first Jew, Abraham, from Ur of the Chaldees in Genesis chapter 12, he said, all the families of the earth are going to be blessed by you. The point was that not only Jews were to be blessed, but Gentiles were to be blessed. This was God's plan all along. God is a missionary God. And sometimes there's a little picture of it. There's a picture of it when Pharaoh proved to be more righteous than Abram in Genesis chapter 12 in the case of Sarah. There was a picture of it when Abimelech proved to be more righteous than Abraham in Genesis chapter 20, when Abraham pretended that she was his sister. And the pagan king said, well, we don't want her then. There was a picture of it when Uriah, the Gentile Hittite, drunk, was more godly than the greatest king of Israel, sober, David. David would sleep with Uriah's wife. Uriah wouldn't sleep with his own wife because he was so loyal to David's army. Amazing. And God is showing all along that He's working in the hearts of Gentiles and that the Jews were to be a blessing for the Gentiles. This was the message Jesus brought. And once the people understood the message that He preached, they tried to kill Him in His own hometown. Amen.